Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us, especially during election week. I know I'm speaking to kindred spirits, and I'm optimistic and hopeful, and I think we have cause for some celebration, at least thus far. Thank you for sharing this space with us during this time and during the pandemic. I am the founder of Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance. But of course, these projects that are community born and community based are not possible without the support of the wonderful colleagues that I have, the board of advisors, my colleagues at Notre Dame, some of whom are here today, and my colleagues at Cambridge and at Harvard. And I'm very grateful to them and indebted to them for everything that they've done to get us off the ground and get us moving. I'd like to also acknowledge that the University of Notre Dame sits on the traditional homelands of Native peoples who've been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. I will be introducing the series as well as our wonderful speakers today. Olivier Morel, who will be our discussant, and our guest, Sinan Antoon, who is here with us today. So Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance, as you know, is an interdisciplinary approach to the global Middle East and North Africa. It's a biannual symposium and lecture series that focuses on the study of literatures that have been shaped by histories of territorial and linguistic politics, colonialism, military domination, and gross human rights violations. The initiative grapples with the constructed nature of history, reimagines American and global history from the position of suppressed voices, and examines how minoritized writers and scholars have historically innovated literary production and theory in the process of responding to systemic violence. Sinan Antoon is a poet, a novelist, scholar, and a translator. He was born in Baghdad and left Iraq after the '91 Gulf War. He holds degrees from Baghdad, Georgetown, and Harvard, where he earned his doctorate in Arabic literature in 2006. He has published 2 collections of poetry and 4 novels. His works have been translated into 13 languages. His translation of one of my personal favorite writers, Mahmoud Darwish, his last prose book, In the Presence of Absence, won the 2012 American Literary Translators Award. And I can't recommend that book enough. It's a beautiful translation, and Sinan's introduction to Darwish is exceptional. His translation of his own novel, The Corpse Washer, won the 2014 Saif Ghobash Prize for Literary Translation and was longlisted for the International Prize for Foreign Fiction. 2 of his novels were shortlisted for the Arabic Booker. His scholarly works include the Poetics of the Obscene, Ibn al-Hajjaj, and Sukhf, and articles on Mahmoud Darwish, Sargon Boulus, and Saadi Youssef. He returned to his native hometown in 2003 to co-direct About Baghdad, a documentary about Baghdad after dictatorship and under occupation. He has published op-eds in The Guardian, The New York Times, The Nation, and various pan-Arab publications. His latest novel, which we'll be discussing today, The Book of Collateral Damage, was published by Yale University just last year. He is an associate professor of Arabic literature at NYU and the co-founder and the editor of the Arabic section of Jadaliyya. And then a French and American scholar and filmmaker, our own dear colleague, Olivier Morel, who's also on the board of advisors for our series, is the director of several feature-length nonfiction films, documentaries, and the author of essays, including 1 graphic novel with the artist and writer Mahmoud. Forgive me if that was the wrong pronunciation, Olivier. His academic work, as well as his films, highlight the importance of creation and the arts, music, literature, cinema, photography, in the perception of historical events. I have been a very big fan of Olivier's work, and he has an exceptional documentary film about American vets who've returned from Iraq and who suffer from severe PTSD and are actually silenced and unable to speak up. And it's a very, very powerful piece of work. So I think it's an exceptional thing to have you both in conversation with one another. Olivier is a joint associate professor in the Department of Film, Television, and Theater and the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures here. So without further ado, I'll turn to you, Sinan, and then Olivier, as our discussant, will be responding. Sinan will be reading to us briefly in Arabic so that we can have the pleasure of listening to the origin language, and then he'll read in English, and Sinan, after that, Olivier will respond, and then I will be moderating with questions. And we will, of course, open up for a good, rigorous conversation afterwards. Thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Azareen, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for establishing this series. I'm truly honored and delighted to be part of it. I think it's quite rare, but it's really urgent to have this space for those of us who do not usually get this space to discuss these issues. And thank you to Olivier, of course, for being the discussant, and for Alyssa and everyone involved in the organization. And thanks for everyone for attending. As Azareen mentioned, I will read a very short excerpt in Arabic just to give you an idea and a taste for those of you who don't know of this barbarous language. And then I will read from the excerpts from the translation, which was done by Jonathan Wright. So I'll read a very short excerpt from what I will read in English now. منطق كاشان. الغالبية الساحقة من الكاشانيات يولدن في كاشان بالطبع. لكن كاشان التي أتحدث عنها هنا بغدادية الروح والجسد. ولدت في بغداد في سجن النساء في أواخر الأربعينيات. لم تكن ولادتها عسيرة، لكنها كانت بطيئة. استغرقت شهورا طويلة. ركعت أمها فيها أمامها كل صباح بصبر من نذرت نفسها لصلاة لا تنتهي. ركعت تسحبها بيدين متعبتين شيئا فشيئا إلى هذه الدنيا دون أن تعاونها قابلة ولا ممرضة أو طبيب. لم تتوقف لشهور طوال إلا لاستراحة قصيرة عند الظهر. تغيب أثناءها لتأكل وجبة بسيطة، ثم تعود بعدها وتنكب على جسد الطفل حتى يأمرها الحارس أن تتوقف بعيد المغرب. فتمس وجه ابنتها بحنو كأنها تودعها قبل أن تعود هي والأخريات اللواتي كن يعملن في تلك القاعة إلى زنازينهن. بعض الأمهات كن يغنين بصوت خافت أو يشاكسن بعضهن البعض حين يكون الحارس بعيدا. أما أمها فكانت تعمل بصمت حجري معظم الوقت، وقلما عرفت الابتسامة طريقها إلى وجهها. في الأسابيع الأولى كانت كاشان صغيرة جدا لا تبصر ولا تفقه شيئا، ولم تتضح لها ملامح أمها إلا عندما اتضحت ملامحها هي، ملامحها التي لا تختلف عن آلاف الكاشانيات. So now I'll read the English, the section called The Colloquy of the Kashan. The vast majority of Kashans are born in the city of Kashan, of course. But the Kashan I am speaking of here is a Baghdad Kashan in body and spirit. She was born in the women's prison in Baghdad in the late 40s. Her birth wasn't difficult, but it was rather slow. For months, her mother knelt in front of her every morning with the patience of someone who had taken a vow of endless prayer. With tired hands, she gradually coaxed her into this world. She did not have a midwife to help her, nor a nurse or a doctor. For months, she stopped only for a short rest at noon, when she would go off to have a simple meal, then come back and work on the body of her daughter until the guard told her to stop a little after sunset. Then she would touch the face of her daughter affectionately as if she were saying good night, before she and the other women working in the room went back to their cells. Some of the mothers would sing softly or quarrel with one another when the guard wasn't around. But this mother worked in stony silence most of the time. A smile rarely found its way to her face. In the first few weeks, Kashan was very small and couldn't see or understand anything. She couldn't make out the features of her mother's face until the features of her own face emerged. Her features were no different from those of thousands of Kashans because they were all heirs to a limited number of designs, with variations that had been in circulation since the 16th century. Her mother's mouth was as small as a cherry, her eyes deep blue under bushy eyebrows. Her complexion was the color of wheat, and her black hair was hidden under a turquoise headscarf that framed her sad face. On her right cheek, a knife had left a deep scar, the same knife that she had picked up off the ground after the attack and planted in the chest of the man who had tormented her for years. That silenced him forever, but she paid a high price for his silence, and she wasn't free for long, less than 4 hours. The old Iranian foreman, who along with his colleagues had been brought from Iran to supervise the training of the women, and who had himself chosen her after giving her a test, would wander around every day inspecting the progress of the work, stand in front of each kashan and watch or make observations. She was delighted when he praised her several times, muttering in Persian, "Bah, bah, khayli khub khanam." After a few months, Kashan had grown in stature until she was almost the height of her mother, who no longer sat cross-legged or bent over, but on a chair. Pride began to fill her heart when she saw the intricate patterns and the fringes of her firstborn Kashan coming toward completion, and the colored lines converging. The lines met, diverged, and skirted the geometrical shapes, arranged regularly within the rectangular frame. When the last knot of Kashan was in place, her mother stood up, amazed at what her hands had made. She ran her hands over the surface of the carpet, kissed it at several spots, and smelled it as her mother had smelled her when she kissed her, because she knew that she would never see her again. The next day, 2 men folded it up, tied it in several places with cord, picked it up and put it in a storeroom in the prison until other ones were ready. They stuck a pin in it to hold in place a piece of paper with Kashan 1, 1949 written on it. The next day, the mother started working on another Kashan that she would also have to abandon as soon as it was finished. The new Kashan lay slumped in the darkness of the storeroom for a month while they put others like it nearby. When there were 10 of them, men loaded them into a van and took them to a carpet store in the Daniel market. It spent 2 months there until it won the admiration of a woman who, along with her husband, was looking for something to decorate their new home. The merchant lied about Kashan's provenance. He didn't say it was born in Baghdad, but insisted it was imported from Iran. The woman added 2 other ones, and our Kashan ended up in the reception room, where it stayed for many years without moving, except at the start of every summer when the carpet beaters came and picked it up with the other ones to beat the dust out of them. Then they rolled them up, tied them up with pieces of cloth to put them behind the furniture or in another room to wait for the weather to turn cold again. But the first time the carpet beaters came, it was frightened and thought they were getting rid of it and that it would languish in darkness for eternity. But it got used to this in subsequent years and began to enjoy its long slumber. It slept and dreamed of the sheep that had given it their fleeces. It saw the sheep gazing on distant foothills, corralled by a shepherd under a balmy sky, and a sun blocked from time to time by clouds driven gently by the wind. Kashan also dreamed of its mother's face and eyes. The lady of the house would later decide to move Kashan to the living room. Her 4 children would play on it and imagine that the lines that ran across the design were streets for their tiny cars. They would see the arches and the small circles as traffic circles where the cars could turn and passers-by could sit. They would drop crumbs of food and spill drops of tea with milk and other drinks on its surface, even drops of blood sometimes. The lady would get angry and tell them off whenever they did that. They would lie on kashan, put cushions under their heads so that they could be close to the television when they were watching cartoons or a long film. They would grow up and get married, move to new homes, and have their own children, but they would still visit the family home with their children on special occasions and holidays. Some of kashan's colors would fade and slight wrinkles would appear on its surface, but it would retain its splendor. From time to time, the lady of the house, who lived into her 70s, would remember the day she bought it. As they sat alone together in front of the television, she would ask her husband if he too remembered. A war would come, and then another, and as usual, she would worry about her children and grandchildren, and ask them to gather in the big family home to allay her fears for them on the first night of the bombing. Some of her grandchildren slept on the bedding she asked them to put on kashan. And then kashan suffocated, not from the weight of the children sleeping on top, because they were lighter than birds, but from the rubble when the house collapsed on them and silenced them forever. Kashan imagined it could see its mother's face, weeping for it and for the children. So I think there's time for a couple of more excerpts. Okay. I saw myself living in a faraway country where everything was clean and tidy. A quiet life without wars, sects, or religions. Immigrants and refugees had all the rights and freedoms that humans could dream of. Even animals were respected and had rights. Technology was so developed that human beings could travel to the future or to the past to visit or to stay, provided, of course, that they were adults and in good health and didn't have a criminal record. Even as I dreamed, I knew I was dreaming because I had lied on the application form. I wrote that I had never been in prison and that I didn't have any health problems. I signed the form without hesitation. I also knew I was dreaming because I was speaking their language fluently. Even the blonde civil servant who reminded me of an actress I had once seen in a sad Swedish film, whose character died at the end of it, said, "You have completely mastered our language. How did you get rid of your accent?" I laughed, of course, and said, "Thanks for the compliment. It's thanks to your schools." They carried out many rigorous tests with modern devices in a clean hospital where classical music was playing everywhere. And the nurses smiled with maternal tenderness. I was worried I might fail the medical test, but I passed. They would let me travel only in one direction, into either the future or the past. On their website, there was a message saying that the Ministry of Time was currently studying the possibility of allowing citizens in the future to travel in both directions. I wasn't interested in the future, of course. I believe that people fall into two types: those who escape from the past and those who escape to it. And the last excerpt, a short one. Well, no, not that short. I peel the moment by hand as if peeling an orange, but it's a blue orange, as in El-Ward's famous poem. The peel of time gets under my fingernails, and the scent reaches my nose. I don't know how to describe it, except to say that I feel like a child, discovering everything for the first time with his fingers, mouth, and eyes. Not the child I once was, another child that I don't know, with no memories and no language. When I finish peeling, I try to break the orange in half, and a vast sea bursts out of it and overwhelms me. I dive into it and breathe like a fish. I grow tired and sleep naked on the seabed. When I wake up, I find myself on wet ground, and the fruit moment awaits there. When I was a butterfly. The butterfly is my mother. My mother was a butterfly that laid her eggs in a moment. All the eggs died except the one I was in. And when my egg hatched, I started crawling, eating, and shedding skin after skin when the old skin wore out. My mother flew off and didn't come back. I wove my cocoon from my tears and my face. I hid inside it and waited a long time. The loneliness preyed on me, so I slipped out of my cocoon. And I flew off looking for my mother. I saw hundreds of butterflies, but none of them was my mother. I almost forgot her. And then my wings took me to a table in a garden. On it lay an open book, the breeze turning the pages. And I caught sight of my mother's body between two pages. My mother is shrouded in words. Thank you.
I guess it's my turn, Azareen, right? You're the moderator, so I'm asking for permission to proceed. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sinan Antoon, for reading this beautiful poem. I call it a poem. This is poetry in so many ways. I want to extend also this word of gratitude to Azareen, to Elisa, to the board, the organizers, the members of the group, Literature of Annihilation, as well as to the sponsors. But I mean, yes, I mean, one of the ways by which I was thinking about expressing my gratitude to Sinan Antoon for being with us today was to continue reading and quoting. So that's what I'm going to do with a short quote from the book poem, the novel. I feel the need to show it to everyone, the Book of Collateral Damage. It's on page 91, 92 for those who have the book in hands, if you want to read with me. And it's a sequence, a scene in this fragmentary way of writing, and I would have many things to say about that, of course, but I will not expand on that for now, in which the narrator is going to the DMV, right? So it's very concrete and very real, but it's one of those moments that I can also very well recognize when the most anodyne questions raise the biggest, the most profound, potentially, right, metaphysical questions, so put salt on the wounds. So I will quote that, right? I mean, the person is showing up in the DMV and there's a question from the employee, and I quote, "I don't have a copy of my birth certificate." "Why not?" "Where is it?" "In Baghdad." "Why?" "Because I was born there." "Can't you call them up and ask them to send it to you?" asks the employee. And the narrator is answering the question. "Ma'am, have you read the news recently or watched television?" I said. "There are manuscripts, hundreds of years old, that have been burned and lost, as well as antiquities and archives. Who's going to look for my birth certificate after all that?" Unquote. That's in the book of Collateral Damage. When I was reading that, of course, I was thinking about our meeting, about the privilege of seeing Sinan Antoon and facing him in this virtual discussion, because I was also thinking about the fact that this very personal story that is told in the text is also the story of the text itself, that is of the poem, of the novel, if you want, and that in fact, this could be the Book of Collateral Damage as the book of the lost, the burned birth certificate. That is, in a way, this book is replacing, is, marking the displacement of origin that is at stake, not just in the fact that the narrator here doesn't have the birth certificate that is required in order to be allowed to drive. And then the narrator is deprived from, the right of driving and having an ID in the book, right? So that goes extremely far, right? It's depriving the narrator from his autonomy, right? So we're thinking about two things, right? The first thing is the substitutive nature of the art of writing, because after all, this is a replacement. This book replaces the birth certificate, and this is the birth certificate, of course, of the writer. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing is, I will reread the sentence here. I quote, "Our manuscripts, hundreds of years old, that have been burned and lost, as well as antiquities and archives," unquote. This is about the destruction of archives. We are talking about how the war in Iraq that starts in 2003 is also one of the most destructive wars and events in which irreplaceable, priceless archives, monuments, artifacts, books, but also lives have been entirely destroyed. And what I would like to highlight here is that is related to again, to the status of the archive that this book is also. So this is the birth certificate of the writer in lieu of the missing birth certificate. This is where the book as a fiction replaces the lost legal fiction of the birth certificate that deprives the driver in the book of his autonomy, of his right to drive and to have an ID. And everyone knows how important it is in the US to have a driver's license. But it is also something like an archive that replaces, and this is complex, but it replaces, it substitutes, right? The lost archive that is an antiquities, artifacts, texts, lives that have been destroyed during the war in Iraq. And I'm very sensitive to the fact, because of course, Azareen, you've mentioned the nature of what I call the death drive, right? In this Freudian term that Sigmund Freud is elaborating during the First World War, when similar destructions are at stake, right? That is I believe the death drive is by a sense an attempt to not just destroy and conquer, but also in the same way to destroy archives. In other words, the very nature of the death drive by Sigmund Freud, as I understand it, would be that it ultimately, by a sense, in a sense, is also a destruction of archives. That essentially, after all, maybe even the death drive consists of the destruction of archives, consists of destroying archives. This could well define the genocidal nature of modernity. That is also the colonial nature of modernity that is at stake and at play at two levels. And Iraq is the epitome, the invasion of Iraq and the destruction of artifacts, of archives and antiquities, as the narrator of the Book of Collateral Damage indicates to this employee in the DMV. There is a double nature of this destruction. One is the destruction itself, but also the destruction of archives, and this notion that is very present in, I believe we call annihilation in this group, which is not just the destruction, but also the destruction of evidence, the destruction of traces, and the effacement of the very fact that there was even a destruction that took place, right? And so this erasure, this massive erasure of memory That is not just the erasure of memory, but the erasure, the effacement of the sole fact that there was even something, right? That is this tabula rasa that is at stake in the way I describe the death drive here, and I hope it's clear, is something that we can also see and read in another passage on page 99-100 in 99-100 in the Book of Collateral Damage. So I will quote. Again, it's one of the narrators who's talking in this, again, in this fragmentary, structure without structure, maybe. There is a structure, of course, in the book, who's saying, I quote this: "At 2 a.m, I settled on PBS. It was Antiques Roadshow, in which the presenter speaks to people who have brought antiques to be valued and sold. Old clocks, pieces of furniture, pictures. The camera came across an ordinary looking woman in her late 50s, standing proudly next to the object she was displaying. What do you have there, ma'am? It's a handmade Native American cradle, real leather. Oh, that's really beautiful. And where did you get that from? It belonged to my grandfather, who was a soldier. I inherited it from my father. And how much is it worth? I've been told I could fetch $46,000. Wow, congratulations, thank you." And I cut here on, just a few sentences later, the narrator is talking. "The ghost of Walter Benjamin hovered in the room, saying, 'I told you, there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism,'" unquote. Now, and this will be my conclusion for this introduction to the discussion, I think there is something extremely powerful and interesting in the book also. That is the fact that we tend to see memory as a form of solidification, even ossification of the past. And I believe that the book is an embodiment, as a birth certificate, if you want. It is an embodiment of the fact that, in fact, history is not the past, right? History is the present, that we carry our history with us, that we are our history. And there's a quote, and this one is the last quote. It's a very short one, that revolves around this idea that memory is always alive, that there is no memory without life, right? That memory is not a dead archive, that memory is in fact, and memorizing as an art of writing that defines the poet, is in fact a way of embodying the past in a dynamic perspective. So I quote, "Memory is not an instrument for explaining the past, but it's theater." I really believe that this idea that memory would not be the past and would not be an archive, that the most ancient written traces that we have in history that have been found in Iraq, that date back from 6,000 years ago, are living signs, are living inscriptions, if you want. And this idea that memory is a theater is, I think, extremely powerful for us today, as we speak, maybe, because it is in line with the idea that that a text is alive, that a text is a performance, and that's a way for me to express again my gratitude to Sinan Antoon, who performed the text and who made it alive, who brought it to life, and who gave a birth certificate to his poem while reading the book a few minutes ago. I don't have questions. Obviously, I have points for reflection on, of course, the obvious tension that that is here at stake between the death drive as a destructive force that destroys archives and also effaces the traces of the destruction. And at the same time, the idea of writing and the art of writing and poetry as a creative form of substitution or replacement of creating the archive of the destruction that is taking place as a conjuration, as a demonstration, you know, as an art of asking for justice, because justice is not deconstructible, and this is also what the book is embodying.
Thank you very much, Olivier and Sinan. I've just listening to your reflections, Olivier. It you know really makes me think about the form of Sinan's novel, which is very much takes the shape of, you know, we could call it a collage in the Western sense, or a kind of arabesque in with reference to, you know, our own literary traditions, our Arabic and Persian literary traditions. And I think that it's very interesting to think about the form from the perspective of that scene that you highlighted, Olivier, regarding the DMV and the restriction of mobility, which is exactly what that is. The denial and erasure of identity, because we can only prove our existence and make a claim to statehood through those kinds of documents, right? And those documents then allow us to have mobility, to have visibility, citizenship, etc. So it's interesting to me to think about that in relation to the form, because it's almost as if this voice, you know, the mobility keeps getting restricted, and therefore another subset of voices or another transformation or metamorphosis has to occur in order for the voice to carry on, right? To have a kind of discursive mobility. So I think that's, you know, of course, the book folds over itself in so many fascinating ways. And I have quite a few questions prepared here, but of course, maybe we won't get through all of my questions, because I'd like to really prioritize conversation, and especially for our graduate student affiliates of the program. If you guys have questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat. And you can feel free to get started. That way I can calibrate and know, you know, how many of my own questions to put forward to get us going and where to stop. But just to begin, Sinan, early on in the Book of Collateral Damage, you write, "I envied Wadud his productivity. I can't even begin. And all this concern, or rather obsession with writing rituals and instruments, only ends in blank pages and silence." A few pages later, the narrator says, "I was going to tell him that I missed being myself and on my own. I was tired of translating everything that was said." Of course, he's talking about being in Baghdad and translating for the filmmakers, but he's talking about a lot more. And in many ways, for me, this is a novel about the impossibility of translation. The translation of a text from a source language, in this case Arabic, to a target language, English, a colonial language. The translation of the migrant self, the Iraqi self, the American self, the returnee self, who returns to both places without ever fully landing in either, or no longer knowing in which direction the return is occurring, something I can closely identify with. And finally, the translation or transformation of texts and archives, as Olivier mentioned, and libraries, from a state of preservation into one of annihilation through the war, right? So the transmission of knowledge to the death of knowledge. When you write about silence, Sinan, what comes to mind for me are the gaps in these multiple translation processes, the parts that don't quite make it across the boundary, the parts that are lost or that remain illegible. Can you talk a little bit about how these silences are operating in the text and the life of the narrator? Are they generative, inhibiting, or both?
Oh, thank you. And thanks to Olivier for the insightful commentary. And for this question is yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, The reason why, before the epigraphs in the book that I chose very carefully, because they speak in a way to the atmosphere of the novel, is a couple of them. One describing the Al-Fihris, the 10th century book by Ibn Nadim, which was an encyclopedia of all the books and the manuscript that existed at that time in Arabic and other languages. So there is the notion of the desire to encompass or to come to terms with destruction and fragmentation. And as you said, one of the themes is the impossibility in the impossibility of coming to terms and encompassing all that was lost. But that failure itself can be rendered in a poetic way, can be beautiful. But the other one is about the book and what the book does, quoting al-Jahib, another great prose writer, that books speak for the dead and translate the speech of the living. And so definitely the silences that exist in the book itself and the fragmentary nature is necessary to my mind, because how does one, what kind of form can one find to translate destruction and fragmentation and the impossibility of translating all of those events into some linear narrative with some kind of resolution and conclusion. I'm totally against resolution and conclusion for aesthetic, but also for political purposes. And this is where Walter Benjamin comes in, whose ghost hovers over the novel, and so many quotes from him are inserted into the novel, because his notion of history and his notion of how the vanquished can try to write their own story and narrative, and also his critique of modernity and the destruction of progress. And so all of that factors in also, and as you said so well, Azareen, this is the challenge was, or one of the themes of the novel is that how does one write about a country, his or her homeland, that has been destroyed time and again from a distance of time and place, while living in the same imperial country that has carried out that destruction? And how does one write about a place where they don't live in anymore without falling into the usual traps that we know about, without appropriating and speaking for as opposed to speaking to? And this is why, you know, the dialectical relationship between Namir and Wadud, and between Namir not wanting to speak for Wadud, wanting to translate Wadud, but also being wary because of ultimately the untranslatability, not just across language, but across from trauma and feelings and desires and pain into language. I mean, there is a very short excerpt in the novel itself later where the narrator kind of wonders, does Wadud really exist, or am I could have been Wadud had I not left, and so on and so forth. But the gaps and the silences, I mean, that was something very important for me, also to write a novel whose form is something that I am happy with, and that frankly also, as you said, very importantly, there are a lot of tributaries to the novel. So there is Walter Benjamin, but also I have been for a very long time fascinated by the prose genres of Arabo-Islamic, Arabic and Persian literature, whereby centuries ago, the book was akin to the novel nowadays, in that it could encompass anything. And so many of these books have biographical elements, have poetry, have history, as long as there is some kind of frame that keeps it all hanging together, which is of course not easy to do. And there are some obvious and less obvious frames here, in that the Persian poet Attar, in a way, is in the book as well, but because we have the Conference of the Birds, which is a kind of a mystical journey, but of course here we begin with a bird that's learning to fly, but at the end, the bird doesn't reach any conclusion or any telos, and there is no enlightenment, and there is no discovery. There is just destruction. So it was also, I mean, as with every book, and I write in Arabic primarily and see myself primarily in the tradition of the Arabic novel also. So of course, the political concerns are always there consciously and unconsciously. But the creative concerns of wanting to write a novel whose form is different, that speaks to all of these together. And of course, being not only just being a translator, but those of us who are migrants are constantly translating, and it gets to be a burden no matter how much you master the second language. And also, frankly, being an academic in the field of Middle Eastern studies and living in the United States of America, we're all called upon, and directly and indirectly, to be native informant. And so many of us spend our entire lives resisting occupying this subject position of translating for or rendering knowledge for the use of the destruction of our homelands and of our cultures.
Thank you, Sinan. Yeah, I thought a lot about the Attar's The Conference of the Birds, and the sort of polyvocal quality of this text, and the ways that maybe in the American literary landscape, books that are polyphonic or multiple voices, multiple narrators, there's a disconnect, right, between like the origin, the source texts from which, and the way that those texts have circulated through the Renaissance, right, through continental Europe into Anglo-Saxon literary traditions. So it was really beautiful to think about the structure of the novel, but also think about, birds are migrants as well. And, symbolically and metaphorically, that's a very powerful way to have begun the book. And Walter Benjamin, I'm sure many of you here are also, big fans. He was a huge anchor in my novel as well, precisely because of his discipline. A quote that you use about you have to return to the same earth and dig the same earth and turn the same soil over and over again. And I think in a sense that is the only gesture, the only archival gesture that can be made, right, is this eternal return to the site of grief, this eternal return to the site of annihilation, as a way of continually remembering, right, while you're also honoring what is forgotten, and trying to come to terms with how forgetting can sometimes be necessary, right, and other times memorializing is necessary. I have another couple of questions, and I see also some wonderful questions from our audience. So I'm going to skip down to a different question that I think is a nice way to segue from what you just said. So there's two questions, and I can collapse them. So one is literature a form of archive? And if so, what is the archival work of the writer in the context of violence and annihilation, which is a big kind of key question for our series. But I think it's complicated, because I wonder how Wadood's refusal to be translated actually complicates or opens up this question further, which you were beginning to talk about. And same with Namir's impulses as an archivist or a collector. And then this brings me to a larger question, which is that there is a correlation throughout the text between torture and the circulation of banned books. So in a way, it's a collection of dismembered bodies as well, the novel itself. There's also a reference to all the cutscenes from the documentary film about torture under Saddam's regime. There's Namir's newspaper clippings, Wadood's text that's present as an absence. So in many ways, the Book of Collateral Damage, and I think this returns to Olivier's point, is pointing to another book or a collection of books that exists beyond the frame of this novel. These other books exist as an absence and as a vanishing. As a writer and a scholar, and as a translator as well, how do you confront a world that is vanishing? How do you confront a history that is disappearing?
That's a wonderful, poignant question. I don't know if I have an answer, but I mean, mourning in a way, by mourning what was lost, and mourning doesn't have to be a negative, here if we speak of Freud or even others, but mourning what was lost, because I want to go back to what Olivier said about the importance of the past, of course, and our construction and our continuous reconstruction and deconstruction of the past, because the past is always deployed in the present and for the future. So I confront it by, writing about it, which I know, of course, and that's in the novel itself, that writing about anything is not going to bring it back. I don't know. So it's some kind of primordial desire that we have as human beings. That's why, in a lot of my writings, the image of carving on the walls of a cave is something that is just the desire to mark a presence, because we know that presence is vanishing. And so it's about collecting fragments and traces as much as one can, because, even as Namir or others, of course, mourn the destruction of the archive, there is another problem in that, of course, archives themselves are exclusionary and are institutions of power that themselves exclude and silence and erase in their own context. That's why there is a part where, thinking of the African proverb of the, if until lions have historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. But then the narrator says, but what about the lion's prey? So the problem is dealing with multiple layers of destruction and vanishing. And I don't know, of course, pre-Islamic classical Arabic poetry is a very important tributary for my work. And, there is the central trope of the entire poetic tradition is the trace, standing where the poet stands before the trace of a previous existence and emotional relationship, and sheds real or imagined tears, and just is baffled by how time, with a capital T, obliterates and destroys everything. And all the poet has is the poem, where they can write down those traces and move on and just learn from all of that. So I don't know if this is a sufficient answer. I just want to go back to a previous thing about structure. I must say, because I'm a bitter person and I hold grudges, that years ago when I was telling my previous agent about the idea of this book, and I was very excited about the structure and the idea, because it took me years to think. And the agent was like, yeah, that's really great and very sophisticated, but that's not going to work, because we need an arc and we need a journey. And that response, it just says it all in a way, about also the gap between those who think of how destructive the present is everywhere, and those who are oblivious and happier than all of us in their oblivion, of course. But oblivion is also an irresponsibility, I think, no matter where one is, of course. Yeah.
Thank you, Sinan. I do think that there's a very sort of fundamental difficulty for writers of Middle Eastern descent in the American landscape, precisely because our sensibility of time and space is actually very different. And you see that in our literary traditions, in the way that aesthetically our work sort of is circular. It doesn't hinge on resolution. It's not thirsty for a kind of denouement in the traditional kind of Western sense. It becomes very difficult to pitch your work, in a sense, because there isn't a lot of tolerance for that sensibility because it honors not knowing, it honors doubt, and it honors silence. And that's kind of, for me, I think as a writer, and I think for you, Sinan, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's sort of about regaining that ground of reinviting and honoring even the silence of our ancestors when we're writing, and bringing that back into the landscape. And for our audience, just to think about how difficult that work is when you're in the context of empire, and there's a certain kind of mild sort of level of psychosis, you know, a kind of controlled psychosis for writers who are Middle Eastern American, and knowing that we're paying taxes and that we are responsible as well for the destruction of our own homeland by being in this space, and also that we don't have a road back for multiple reasons, you know, that are very difficult to go into here because they're unique for each person. So I think that that's a really interesting gesture of resistance, a really interesting act of seeing the continuities about, you know, the writing in the American landscape becoming more open to, you know, First Nation writers, becoming more open to Black writers, to Middle Eastern writers, and seeing the continuities and how violence is archived in literature, and how there is a really serious, almost, you know, fear, like a dread of allowing us to archive this, allowing us to make these things visible. So I think there's a lot to celebrate in the fact that you published your novel, and that you know, there is a journey, but that it's not kind of fulfilling this American ideal of the literary performance, and yet it is compulsively readable and just gorgeous. So I'm going to actually skip my questions. You know what they are, Sinan and Olivier, and they can just exist between us. But I really want to come to our audience here, and I'm just going to start from what I think is the top with Abir Alwan. So Abir is asking, and maybe Abir, would you like to? It would be nice to hear other voices. Are you still with us? And would you like to unmute? And
yes, yeah. So I am originally from Iraq, and I discovered Sinan's novels just last year, and I read all 4 of them in Arabic, and I absolutely loved every one of them. And in fact, I belong to a book club, and this last novel was discussed, and 3 of us read it in Arabic and 1 read it in English. And I was really impressed by the translation. I thought the translation, I didn't think that the translation could give justice to, you know, to the novel, but actually it was really great. So yeah, I am a big fan, and you know, really proud of him and his work. And what I really like about it, it's this issue of memory, because for me, I dealt with memory in a very different way. I erased my memories. I shut down. It was the only way for me to move forward. I left Iraq in the beginning of, earlier than you, 1980. So just as the Iran-Iraq war was happening. And the way for me to deal with what happened was to erase them, simply erase them and move on. And I had new friends who replaced my relatives, and I succeeded to a large degree. And then now, 40 years later, after my kids are grown and settled in my job and everything, I find myself yearning to remember. And so it was really a beautiful journey to read the books, because it was very honest about that and the power of memory. And so one question I had 2 questions, rather simplistic, because I'm actually an engineer, so I am not into literature like the rest of you. But the titles were different between the English and Arabic novels, and some of them actually were, you know, like The Corpse Washer was really a direct reference to the book, whereas Shajarat Rumman, you know, also was beautiful. So I was really curious about how the titles were chosen. And the second question is related to the last book. We had a long debate in our book club meeting about whether the experts from Wadud were inserted, or from the Fahras were inserted randomly in the text, or was there any connection with what Namir was going through? Thank you in advance.
No, thank you so much. I'm so happy that you like the novels and that you read them. And by the way, the novel that I'm writing now is about two Iraqi refugees in the US, one of whom does exactly what you wanted to do, decides to completely erase Iraq and start in a new slate and change his name and even lie about his background because it was too much of a burden.
Yes.
But then, so I'll start with the last, the novel, not totally randomly, but the novel itself in its form is the file that Namir was keeping in trying to write a novel. And so they are not totally inserted randomly, but there is this, of course, I went back and tried to have space in between them and all of that. But in a way, they're standalone pieces. Wadud's pieces can be basically anyway, but obviously, towards the end, we see how Wadud's psychological state is deteriorating, and then you have these excerpts that are highly poetic, but that don't make any sense. So it's not totally random, but there's also some fluidity in putting that. About the titles, it's always a struggle with the editors and American publishers. In particular, there's even an article written by Marilyn Booth, a highly respected scholar and translator, about her own struggles with the attempts of American publishers and editors to domesticate texts that come from the global South. So with the Corpse Washer, the original title, which I'm very happy with, is The Pomegranate Alone. And the French translation, the publisher never even brought up changing the title. But the American publisher insisted that, and even though my friends told me not to say this story, but that The Pomegranate Alone was too poetic, in which I had to say, only in America is poetic a liability. Because everywhere else in the world, poetic is good. So I wasn't happy because it's so prosaic and so straightforward. And of course, they were doing it supposedly to increase sales, but I actually thought people are gonna think it's a Gothic novel. The same thing happened with Ya Maryam, which is about two Christian characters from a Christian Iraqi family from two different generations. And Ya Maryam is the call to Mary that is so common. And Ave Maria was rejected, and keeping the original title is something I am always for, but that's also rejected. With Fahris is very difficult to translate because the word has so many meanings. And of course, my preference was to keep it as Fahris, but of course that's very scary for publishers. So this was the compromise that I was not that upset by, because it was my choice. Because catalog is just to, index is too prosaic, because Fahris has a different resonance and it's an index, and so on and so forth. So what can we do? This is the compromise. But I'm very happy that you like the novels and that they speak to you, and very good choice for your book club.
Thank you. And I have to say also that, like your character in the forthcoming book, when people used to ask me where I was from, and it was during the Iran-Iraq War, my answer was always Jordan, because it was neutral and pro-US. For a very long time, I was Jordanian. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is by one of our graduate student affiliates and our communications coordinator for Literatures of Annihilation. Mary, would you like to unmute so you can ask your question directly, or would you prefer me to read?
Yeah. Hi, Sinan. Thank you so much for that beautiful reading. So in the middle of reading your book, I actually read an article for a class where it's actually the same class where I just encountered Walter Benjamin for the first time. But we read an article by a scholar named Leah Price about an 18th century, I think, European genre called it narratives, or books narrated by objects or animals, or even sometimes books themselves. And it was, I thought about your book immediately, and because I found the colloquies to be some of the most devastating passages, I think. And I think maybe it was because I attribute kind of an innocence to the objects that you're writing from, like the lote tree and the rug and the birds and the oven. So I've only ever lived in and been educated in the US, and narratives told by objects, I think in my experience, are usually only found in children's books here, and adult narratives are usually much more anthropocentric. And actually, I think kind of for anybody to suggest that objects seriously do have lives or perspectives would be considered like schizophrenic ideation, maybe in the eyes of the psychiatrist in your book. So in the Western white model. So the way that you arranged the novel to me created this sense that the souls of exiled and brutalized people are intertwined with the objects around them. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the narrative and poetic power that you found in stepping into the consciousness of these objects, and how you kind of decided to intersperse those narratives with those of Namir and Wadud. And I also wondered if there were traditional Iraqi or Arabic sacred texts that take up that tradition as well, like the colloquy of the Conference of the Birds. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. You know, there are several aspects. One of them is, you know, when I was thinking of the idea of as the space where one feels at home, or home is not just the physical structure, but all of the objects and the beings that are there in the home and the garden, all of that form, this constellation is what home is. That's one aspect. The other issue is, I mean, the nucleus of the novel started out in 2005. I was just thinking of how to write about all the destruction that had taken place. And I thought I wanted to write, like we do, the history of 1 minute, that a book would be just 1 minute and all the objects that are destroyed in 1 minute. And initially I thought it's just to think of what one missile destroys. But then I thought, you know, again, having said everything I said, that of course that would be too reductive in a way. But believe it or not, I credit poetry with everything. But in this pre-Islamic poetry and other traditions as well, everything speaks actually. And I mean, ultimately, the poet is the main speaker, but the poet encounters the entire world. And what I said about the traditional tropes, but nature plays such a huge part. And everything in nature speaks to the poet. Now later, the Sufi tradition also is very important and is very important influence on the novel. But it's poetry in a way, even modern poetry, because in poetry, everything speaks. And, you know, ironically, a few years ago, there were studies came out in Germany and elsewhere about how trees actually communicate. Now we know that trees communicate with each other. And this shows how the poets anticipated science in a way, of course. So it's not just metaphors, but it's basically that for me, having started out as a poet and that I continue to read a lot of poetry and translate a lot of poetry, where the relationship of human beings to their surroundings and to the sentient beings is really paramount. And since we're speaking about destruction, the destruction of this planet, which has reached unprecedented heights and speeds in the last few decades, has so much to do with the way, of course, we imagine our being on this planet and how we do not think of other objects and sentient beings as that are alive. So the notion that objects speak come from the pagan pre-Islamic poetry, which is kind of the classical corpus that I love so much. And one last thing is that the pre-modern books in Arabic and Persian and other languages, actually, there were so many books that were solely devoted to writing about animals and objects. I benefited from that when I was writing my dissertation about this famous poet who was infamous for being the most obscene poet in the history of Arabic literature. But I got into some side projects where I realized that there were so many books that were solely concerned with cataloging and describing animals, objects. So it's very fascinating. I think all of that helped me in that and that's what is so fascinating about the novel as a form, is that actually it can encompass anything as long as you deliver the aesthetic pleasure, and that it somehow still hangs together.
Yeah, it's definitely an infinite container. So the next question is from Austin, and then from Nazli Koka.
So I think you spoke on this a little when you were describing the difference between people who are, oblivious and happy in their oblivion, and those who are aware sort of the violence and destruction sort of embedded everywhere. But one thing that really struck me in this novel, besides of course the colloquies being, this archive of destroyed objects, is sort of this seamless, like poetic and political blending of these details into Namir's story during moments that maybe in like an American publishing landscape might not strike readers or writers as like needing to be inherently political. For example, I think this is embodied really well on page 127, when Namir is looking for Mariah in the coffee shop, and he sort of pauses to ruminate on like the history of the international coffee trade, and then how he drank tea, a communal drink, when he was in Iraq, and how coffee is, much more individual. And then it sort of, again, very seamlessly blends back to him asking the white barista, oh, is Mariah here? And it doesn't slow down at all. And it's very, like natural. And, like American publishers are always telling us not to be didactic. But of course, this book is, in moments where it's like inherently like extremely political, but it's political. But even when it's, like making its more, its point that seems to be just like, this guy's like trying to, date somebody. We're still like sort of allowed to enter this mode. And I think a lot of writers who might want to consider themselves apolitical could learn a lot from passages like these, by imbuing otherwise like descriptive moments with history, violence, and still beauty. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that a little, like, did the structuring of this book as, this archive of destroyed objects help you in sort of like, also like imbuing these moments into Namir's more straightforward narrative passages? And yeah, if you could speak to that, like as a writing process even.
Well, thank you. That's a great question. And really, I mean, frankly, I jokingly say that if there aren't no benefits to growing up under a dictatorship or in a place like Iraq or Iran, but perhaps you intuitively understand how everything is political and how politics is everywhere. And what really struck me when I first moved to this country in '91, but continues to strike me on a daily basis, even in academia, this notion of non-ideological or non-political, or so-and-so is of course, it's a myth. That's the very, very political gesture, is to assume, because of course, the center or the liberal center, or that is the camouflaging of politics, because there's power everywhere around us. There are structures of power and violence, and no one is outside of the structures of violence. So everyone, whether they like it or not, falls somewhere on the ideological spectrum, of course. That which seems to be non-ideological is what has been sanctified by the structures of power as being the norm. And we know from history how the normal and the non-political has always been very political. And as you said, of course, I mean, whether with agents or publishers, of course, they shy away and, they don't want to. That's why, this has come up, the dearth of novels about working class folks, right? Because primarily the publishing industry, commercial publishing industry, is interested in a certain block of readers. But for me, I mean, this is obviously, I wrote this novel, and a lot of it, it's not autobiographical, but there are a lot of autobiographical elements. but this is how someone who could be from Iraq or from Iran or Afghanistan or Yemen, whichever country that's receiving American bombs, lives in this country. And this is how there is no escape, really. One cannot escape this reality. I mean, I'm not the first one. One of my favorite poets was an Iraqi poet who left Iraq at a young age and went to Lebanon and then came to California and lived in the US throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And his trajectory is very interesting because he started out in Beirut at a certain point where he was, against nationalism and against party politics and was quite liberal and, had dreams of this Whitmanian America. And then he comes to California and then slowly he realizes, especially in the 80s, that there is no outside of politics, and he gets radicalized by Southern California politics, but what Reagan was doing and later, and with 91 and the 2003, he is really wounded by that he is living, and he has several poems about that, living in a country where people are raising flags and people are celebrating. And those, some of you are too young to remember the atmosphere. I wasn't here. I was in Baghdad in 1991. But when I came and then I watched the footage, the atmosphere and the discourse of the media and so many fellow citizens, and the way the destruction of Iraq was celebrated is really, really something to think of and to wonder. So, yeah, I think, again, those who think that they're apolitical are actually much more political. But I mean, it's not to keep complaining, but there are ways of navigating all of this. And to me, I mean, my idols are people like Toni Morrison and others, and recently. So it was about, as she says, writing that she's not interested, or at least she said she wasn't interested in what white readers or white critics were thinking, because she had a certain, community in mind or a certain history to write about. Not that she wasn't writing for everyone, but she was primarily interested in telling this set of stories that have not been told. And that's what I am trying to do in a way.
So Nazli, we'll go to you. We have about 10 minutes left and quite a few questions. So just to keep that in mind, and then I'll have to make some closing announcements. But Nazli, go ahead, and then Hanan.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you Olivier and Azareen too for being such good discussants. I've missed your voices. Okay, Sinan, thank you so much for all the excerpts that you read. I was okay, I'm going to cut it short. So I wonder what you think about translation policies of different English-speaking publishing houses. Recently, I was contacted for potentially translating a Turkish novel into English. By them, I was going to be commissioned out of nowhere. And then they said, oh, wait a minute, we realized that there's a house rule of our publisher. We only allow native speakers of English to translate novels. And I was like, this is another level of Kafkaesque stuff. Like, I'm not even trying, and you're attacking me with all this colonial policies. And I realized this is probably how so many publishers work. And this is how like so many of our nuances get erased, because like if we translate something to English and we make a couple of mistakes, an English speaking editor can correct that. But if a non-native Turkish speaker misses something, like there's no way of taking that back. And, but I was wondering if like you agree that there is any sort of difference between the two at all, or maybe it's just the same thing, or am I being defensive? And maybe another question is like, how, regardless of translation, do you believe in like differences between like an Eastern voice and a Western voice? Because I remember once in Johannes's class, I was sarcastically referring to us being emotional and arabesque and the West being cold and sophisticated. I mean, I'm always half joking and half serious, but then Johannes was like, no, that is not correct. Anyway, so I wonder if you agree or disagree, or if you have anything to say about that. Thank you.
No, I mean, about the translation, this is always a minefield, and it depends on the publishers. And, you know, of course, there are the great small publishers and the university publishers who are genuinely interested in changing the landscape and in giving opportunities. But a lot of the publishers are, you know, they're interested in profit, ultimately, at the end of the day. But I think, you know, one can be a great translator, whether you're a native speaker or not. And of course, you know, native speakers, well, there are a lot of things in the text that have to do with the culture and require certain knowledge and depth that is difficult for a non-native speaker. But I wouldn't categorize that, but that's a very problematic policy that they have, because some of the greatest translators are not native speakers of English, and vice versa. The other question about East and West, I'm always reminded of Edward Said's sentence that East and West are supreme fictions. So are there differences? There are differences, of course, but also people also internalize these fictions, and so the fictions become realities. But I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. I prefer to think of the world in a different way, not with East and West, but with global South and global North. And that's not geographic, because we have, you know, we have global North in the South, and so on and so forth, and vice versa. I don't think that's a very satisfying answer to your question, but that's the best that I could come up with. But I should just say that I think, you know, I know one wants to make a living and of course live, but you know, translation is also just a practice, you know, for if one has the time, of course, and we live in very difficult times, but it's for personal pleasure. And for me as a writer, translation is a way to expand my own palette, because as a translator, I internalize the rhythms of the writers that I'm translating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have, hold on, I'm trying to scroll through. I believe it was Hanan. Are you still with us?
All right, thank you very much. I was saying thank you very much for hosting this event publicly. I am a researcher in literary theory and comparative literature at Autonomous University of Barcelona, and I'm working on contemporary Iraqi fiction post-2003. And of course, Sinan's work is like, Sinan is the superstar in my thesis. And I'm apart from being a huge fan, I think the Book of Collateral Damage saved my life and saved the lives of so many young Iraqis living abroad. And so my question is about contemporary Iraqi fiction in general. And as you were reading that extract on Kashan, I was thinking of how any attempt of writing or any attempt of writing fiction that we can call contemporary Iraqi fiction is in a way Kashan herself. That is, this comes because I read the Book of Collateral Damage with my family, and it was very surprising that my mother and my father identified more with Wadud, while I identified with Namir. And there were these, I don't know, generational things, maybe because my parents, although they live in a European city, they still live in Baghdad in their minds and hearts. And so it made me think that how contemporary Iraqi fiction has these so many layers that could be read from so many different directions, but in the end it feels like any writing any novel will just, you know, you will fold it, and under it you will have lives of those young children who are lying on Kashan under the roof of on the layers of destruction, and unable to transmit so many I don't know, experiences, suffering. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about contemporary Iraqi fiction more than the Book of Collateral Damage itself.
No, thank you, Hanan, so much for your kind words, and I'm very happy to be part of your thesis. And yes, definitely. I mean, But then if I speak of contemporary Iraqi fiction, I have a lot of critical comments that might not go well to some of my peers. But I think what you brought up is very important now. So 1/4, I think, or 1/5 of Iraqis live outside of Iraq. We have a huge diaspora that has millions. Then it spreads from Australia to Alaska. So of course, and then, and we have different generations and waves. There are the Iraqi Jews who were kicked out in the 1950s, and then later we have the communists, and then the Iraqis who were supposedly of Iranian origin that were kicked out in 79, and then the people who left during the 90s because of the sanctions. So we have different generations and different ways of remembering Iraq. This is part of the novel that I'm writing now. But one structural and historical reality is that, throughout the Saddam Hussein period, the state was so powerful and was in total control of cultural production inside Iraq. And of course, this was pre-digital age, so it was very difficult to communicate with the outside world. And because of the Iraq-Iran war, everything was mobilizational literature. And so there were very few people who could smuggle, or so much of that literature, I think, frankly, is, damaged commodities. And it's horrible because it was written with a specifically propagandist approach. Of course, there are exceptions here and there, and people resorted to symbolism and allegories and so on and so forth. Those who were outside, also they didn't have a lot of outlets because so many Arab language publications, even in Europe, were bought by the Iraqi regime. And then in the 90s, because of the sanctions and what it did to Iraqi society and social fabric, that also affected cultural production by and large. So what we have in Iraqi contemporary fiction is that we have almost 30 years that by and large people were not able to write about, except those who are living in the diaspora. But we have another problem, of course. I am never in favor of any control, of course, needless to say. But we have the chaos that we have in Iraq in every facet of life exists also in the cultural field. And it also has to do with the deterioration of the structures of publication, literary publication in the Arab world. So, and Hanan, all of that, but I'm saying it for the benefit of the audience, and that, after 2003, a lot of folks, especially in the US, think that having tens of newspapers is a sign of freedom, but it's a sign of chaos. And so a lot of Iraqi writers are trying to compensate for so many epochs that have not been written about. But frankly, also, there is the other twofold problem of so many Arab writers writing for translation, because that's one way to reach the outside world and to get some monetary compensation. And the other problem is these new state-sponsored prizes in the Gulf. And I acknowledge I participated in them in the past, and some of my work was shortlisted, but these prizes have had a very deleterious effect on the type of novels that are written. And, I can talk about that for a very long time, but we don't have time. But in a way, it almost over-determines the type of themes and ways that novelists write, because throughout the history of these prizes, they've tended to favor certain types of narratives that are already speaking to the putative audience of translated works. And they fund a lot of these translations. So that has been deleterious in a lot of writers thinking, I should write about minorities because that's what will get the attraction of the global North. Not that, of course, one should always write about minorities of all types and speak to the silences. But so contemporary Iraqi fiction, of course, there are some great, amazing writers, but frankly, by and large, so many writers are at pains to appeal to the committees of the Booker or to get translated. And the other aspect is the complete collapse of print media. I mean, when I grew up, we had literary supplements, we had cultural pages that one could read and learn from. Now we have only one cultural supplement of al-akhbar for 300 million people. We don't have really good website. I mean, it's a global problem in a way, of course, the demise of print journalism and book supplements and all of that. But in the Arab world and in Iraq, it's a disaster. So we have a completely different landscape. But as I said, to accentuate the positive, there are several excellent writers inside Iraq and outside who, of course, are continuing. And I should say, I understand the focus after 2003 because that's a monumental event, but we have someone like Ghaib Ta'ama Farman, who for me is the greatest Iraqi novelist early on, and others as well. And I consider myself part of that tradition, and of Samir Naqash, the Iraqi Jewish writer, who is an example for me because he went to Israel, and unlike most of the others, he did not write in Hebrew. And that meant losing out in all kinds of institutional support or interest from academics, because he wanted to write in Arabic, because he wanted to write about Baghdad and its dialect and its atmosphere. That's why you rarely hear of him when people speak of Israeli writers, even of Arab origin, because they speak of the ones who wrote in Hebrew. Sorry for going so long, but it's an excellent question from Hanan.
No, I think it's actually a very urgent question, and thank you, Hanan, for joining us from Barcelona, which is the city of my heart. Lovely to have you here. Thank you so much, Sinan. Thank you so much, Olivier. It's such an honor to be here with you guys, and such an honor to have everybody here with us. Such a privilege. I have a few announcements. So, as you guys may already know from our website, we have interviews with all of our speakers. So Ibtisam Azam, who was here with us just earlier, she may still be here with us, Palestinian writer of the Book of Disappearance. The interview with her is now up on our website, conducted by one of our graduate student affiliates. Please read it, please share it. We can't do enough to amplify Palestinian voices. It's a critical gesture, and especially during these times. And the interview with Sinan by Sarah Judy, another one of our graduate students, will be up soon. And I wonder if it might be interesting for Sinan, if you have the time and the energy, to add a few recommendations of Iraqi writers, just to kind of complete the circle on that really important last question. And others were asking about specific names in the chat that we didn't get to. So thank you to all of you for the questions, and I apologize that we weren't able to get through all of them. Up next in December, we have a different kind of talk, very critical one by two of our own colleagues at Notre Dame on censorship and silence, a global historical approach. So we will be speaking with Michelle Hawkes, who's a professor of Chinese literature, who will be speaking about Chinese writers in China who get censored abroad for not being critical enough of China and its policies. And we have our board of advisor and fellow colleague LaDonna Forsgren, who will be speaking about Sisterhood is Powerful, her new wonderful book that just won a major award, Recovering Black Women Intellectuals of the Black Arts and Black Power Movements. After that, in January, I'll be reading with Isabella Hamad and Amir Aryan. And then we have a major event with our collective beloved Elias Khoury in January. So in February, forgive me. So we will be sending you all more information. If you want to join our listserv, please do. And before we leave, a very, very special thanks to all our graduate student affiliates for all the hard work you've done. And then especially to Alyssa Doro, because none of this would happen without all of her technical and intellectual support. So thank you, Alyssa, and thank you, everybody. Thank you, Sinan.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was wonderful.
Take care, everybody.